The wine glass shattered against the bar, red liquid spraying across the polished mahogany like blood. Shards scattered across the floor, glinting under the dim restaurant lights. "Are you completely useless?" Greta's voice cut through the dining room, sharp and cold. Every customer turned to stare. The couple at table 12 stopped mid-bite. The family near the window froze with forks halfway to their mouths. I stood there, wine dripping down my white shirt, my apron soaked through. My face stayed calm even though my heart pounded against my ribs. She wasn't finished. "I don't understand why we're paying someone who can't even remember a simple wine order. Are you trying to sabotage us?" Her husband Trevor stood behind her, arms crossed, nodding along like a bobblehead. They both looked at me like I was dirt on their expensive shoes. I took a slow breath, letting the humiliation settle into my chest. I wiped my face with a bar towel, my hands steady despite the anger burning inside me. They thought I was just another waiter. Just another employee they could abuse and discard. They had no idea who I actually was. This wasn't just their restaurant. It was mine too. My name is Marcus Brennan, and I didn't just work at the Copper Kettle. I helped create it. 7 years ago, I was there from the very beginning. I coordinated the first supplier deliveries. I worked alongside the original head chef, learning every recipe, perfecting every dish. I stayed up late redesigning the floor plan to maximize seating without losing intimacy. And when the restaurant needed additional funding to open, I provided it. Not as a loan. As an investment. A legal partnership with a 35% ownership stake. The original owner, Harold, had been my mentor. He taught me everything about the restaurant business. When he got sick last year, he'd sold his majority share to Greta and Trevor without telling them about my stake. They thought they owned everything. They thought they could change whatever they wanted, fire whoever they pleased, run things however they saw fit. But my contract was ironclad. Silent partner status with full access to financial records and decision-making authority if the restaurant faced significant mismanagement. I wasn't listed on the business license. I wasn't mentioned in any press releases. I worked as a waiter to stay close to operations, to see everything happening on the ground level. Greta and Trevor had no idea I was watching their every mistake. The Copper Kettle had been a neighborhood institution for 6 years before Greta and Trevor arrived. People came for the warmth, the quality, the feeling that they were part of something special. We'd built relationships with local farms. Our produce came from just outside the city, picked fresh 3 times a week. Our beef came from a family ranch 2 hours north. Even our bread was baked by a local bakery that had been in business for 40 years. But Greta and Trevor didn't care about any of that. Within their first month, they started cutting corners. They switched to a cheaper produce distributor. They stopped ordering the premium cuts of meat. They wanted everything cheaper, faster, more profitable. The regular customers noticed immediately. Mrs. Patterson, who'd celebrated her anniversary here every year for 5 years, sent back her salmon twice before leaving. The Hernandez family, who came every Sunday after church, stopped making reservations. The staff noticed too. Our head chef, Vincent, a 60-year-old master who'd trained in France, was told his recipes were too expensive and complicated. When he protested, Greta fired him. Just like that. 30 years of experience, dismissed in a 5-minute conversation. I made sure Vincent knew he had options. I connected him with other restaurants. I wrote him letters of recommendation. And I documented everything. 3 months after taking over, Greta and Trevor announced their big plan. A complete rebrand. They hired an expensive consulting firm from the city. 20-somethings in designer suits who'd never worked in a restaurant came in with clipboards and ideas about maximizing brand potential. The result was a disaster. They changed the name from the Copper Kettle to Kettle and Company. They replaced our warm copper lighting with harsh white LEDs. They redesigned the menu with smaller portions at higher prices. They added pretentious descriptions like deconstructed comfort food and elevated rustic cuisine. A burger that used to cost $12 now cost $22 and came with half the fries. The launch party was a disaster. They invited food bloggers and social media influencers instead of our loyal customers. They served tiny portions on huge plates. They played loud electronic music that clashed with everything the restaurant had been. I worked that night watching it all unfold. Watching Greta schmooze with people who would never come back. Watching Trevor argue with the kitchen staff about presentation. Our regular customers weren't even invited. Within 2 weeks, our reservation rate dropped by 40%. Within a month, we were losing money for the first time in 6 years. But Greta and Trevor blamed everyone except themselves. Trevor called a mandatory staff meeting on a Monday morning. We all gathered in the dining room, servers and kitchen staff standing in awkward clusters. He stood at the front like a general addressing troops, his arms crossed, his face stern. "Things need to change," he announced. "We're implementing new standards. Anyone who doesn't meet them will be replaced. We need team players, not people stuck in the past." The message was clear. Agree with everything we say or leave. I stood in the back watching faces around me. Some of the younger servers looked nervous. The kitchen staff looked angry. Our sous chef, Patricia, had tears in her eyes. When Trevor finished his speech, I raised my hand. "What happens if your changes are what's causing the problems?" The room went silent. Trevor's face darkened. "Excuse me? Our customer base is down 40% since the rebrand. Our food costs are up but quality is down. Maybe the issue isn't the staff. Maybe it's the strategy." Trevor stepped closer, his jaw tight. "If you have a problem with how we run this restaurant, Marcus, you're welcome to find employment elsewhere." I smiled slightly. Not a friendly smile. A knowing one. I'll keep that in mind. The first walkout happened on a Friday night, our busiest service of the week. Patricia, our sous chef, had been working at the Copper Kettle for 4 years. She was talented, reliable, and beloved by the entire staff. But Greta had been criticizing her constantly, undermining her authority, changing her prep lists without warning. That Friday, Greta stormed into the kitchen in the middle of dinner service and started screaming about how a dish was plated. "This looks like trash. Are you deliberately trying to make us look bad?" Patricia, normally calm and professional, had finally had enough. She set down her knife, untied her apron, and walked out. No yelling. No dramatic speech. She just left. 3 line cooks followed her immediately. Then 2 prep staff members. Within 5 minutes, the kitchen staff was cut in half. During our busiest service. With 40 tables waiting for food. Greta and Trevor were left scrambling, trying to figure out how to keep the kitchen running. The remaining staff was overwhelmed. Tickets backed up. Food got delayed. Customers started complaining. I watched it all from the dining room, refilling water glasses and taking orders like nothing was wrong. I talked to Patricia the day before. I told her she deserved better. I'd given her contact information for 3 other restaurants that would hire her immediately. I hadn't told her to walk out. But I'd made sure she knew she had options. The next morning, Greta called me into the small office they'd taken over from Harold. She sat behind the desk, her expression cold and controlled. Trevor stood behind her like a bodyguard. "We know you've been talking to staff members," Greta said. "Encouraging them to leave. Undermining our authority." I stood calmly, my hands in my pockets. "I've been talking to friends and colleagues. If they choose to leave because they're being mistreated, that's on you, not me." Her eyes narrowed. "If you continue causing problems, Marcus, you will regret it." I met her gaze without flinching. "You've turned a profitable, beloved restaurant into a failing business in 3 months. If anyone should have regrets, it's you." The silence between us was thick and dangerous. Trevor stepped forward. "Get out. Now." I smiled slightly and left. They thought they had power over me. They thought threats would make me fall in line. They had no idea that every threat, every mistake, every moment of mismanagement was being carefully documented. I didn't cause chaos. I just let the truth spread naturally. When Patricia found a new job at an upscale restaurant downtown, word got around. She told her story to other industry people. They told their friends. Soon, everyone in the local restaurant community knew about Greta and Trevor's management style. When suppliers started hearing complaints about late payments and quality disputes, they became less willing to extend credit or offer good terms. When the original line cooks who'd left started working at competing restaurants, they brought some of our regular customers with them. People followed quality, not locations. I didn't have to do much. I just had to be available. I answered questions when staff members asked for advice. I made introductions when people needed new opportunities. I shared information when suppliers wanted to know if Greta and Trevor were trustworthy. The restaurant's reputation was crumbling, not because I was attacking it, but because the new owners were destroying it from the inside. Our reservation book, once full weeks in advance, now had empty pages. Our revenue dropped month after month. Reviews online started turning negative. And through it all I kept working. Serving tables. Smiling at customers. Documenting everything. Trevor's next big idea was to cut labor costs by reducing staff hours and combining positions. He announced that servers would now also work as hosts and bussers. Kitchen staff would handle prep, cooking, and cleanup. He cut everyone's hours by 30% but expected the same amount of work. The remaining staff was exhausted and demoralized. Service quality dropped even further. Mistakes became common. The dining room felt chaotic instead of comfortable. But Trevor insisted his plan was working. Labor costs are down 15%, he announced proudly at another staff meeting. This is exactly the kind of efficiency we need. No one mentioned that revenue was down 35%. That customer complaints had tripled. That employees were quitting weekly. I watched it all with quiet satisfaction. They were digging their own grave with every decision. One evening, a health inspector showed up for a surprise visit. Someone had filed a complaint about food safety practices. I had no idea who might have done that. But the inspector found multiple violations. Improper food storage. Inadequate cleaning procedures. Missing documentation. The restaurant received citations and warnings. Greta was furious, convinced someone had sabotaged them. She was right. But she was looking in all the wrong places. 4 months after Greta and Trevor took over, the copper kettle was barely surviving. Our customer base had shrunk to a fraction of what it had been. Regular staff had been replaced by inexperienced workers who quit within weeks. The kitchen was a revolving door of stressed, underpaid cooks. The financial situation was critical. I had access to the books through my partnership agreement, which Greta and Trevor still didn't know about. They were burning through cash reserves. Their fancy rebrand had cost a fortune. Their inefficient operations were bleeding money. They'd taken out additional loans to cover shortfalls. According to my calculations, they had maybe 2 months before the restaurant became insolvent. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, a sharp woman named Veronica who'd helped structure my original partnership agreement. They've violated multiple provisions in the operating agreement, she explained, reviewing documents spread across her conference table. The mismanagement clause, the financial transparency requirements, the stakeholder consultation rules. You have grounds to force a buyout or take operational control. I nodded slowly. How long will it take? If we file the paperwork tomorrow, we could have a hearing within 3 weeks. Do it. She smiled. They have no idea what's coming, do they? None at all. The next day, Trevor received a certified letter from Veronica's law firm. I wasn't there when he opened it, but I heard about it from the office manager. Apparently he went pale, then red, then started yelling about lawsuits and fraud. He called me that afternoon, his voice shaking with anger. What the hell is this, Marcus? You're suing us. I'm not suing. I'm exercising my legal rights as a minority stakeholder. There's a difference. You're a waiter. You don't own anything. I let the silence stretch out before responding. Check your predecessor's sale documents. Check the operating agreement. I own 35% of this restaurant. I have since it opened. And according to our contract, I can call for a management review if the business faces significant mismanagement. More silence. You're a partner? Silent partner. But I'm not staying silent anymore. He hung up without another word. An hour later, Greta showed up at the restaurant, her face twisted with rage. She found me in the dining room, setting tables for evening service. You scheming little snake. You've been sabotaging us this whole time. I set down the silverware carefully. I've been documenting your incompetence. There's a difference. We'll fight this. We'll bury you in legal fees. I smiled. Go ahead. My lawyer works on contingency. Yours doesn't. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, things at the restaurant became unbearable. Greta and Trevor stopped speaking to me except through other staff members. They tried to schedule me for the worst shifts, hoping I'd quit. They wrote me up for minor infractions, building a paper trail they thought would help their case. But I just kept working, kept documenting, kept being professional. Other staff members noticed the tension. Some asked questions. I explained the situation honestly when asked directly. Word spread quickly. The servers, kitchen staff, and managers realized I wasn't just a waiter. I was an owner fighting to save the restaurant from people destroying it. Suddenly, people started paying more attention. They noticed how Greta spoke to employees. They tracked Trevor's poor decisions. They started documenting things too without being asked. One of the bartenders created a shared folder where staff could upload evidence of management issues. Photos of spoiled food Trevor had refused to throw out. Voice recordings of Greta berating employees. Screenshots of customer complaints. I didn't ask for any of it. But I didn't refuse it either. The case against Greta and Trevor was building rapidly, and they were too angry to see it happening. The day before the hearing, Greta did something unforgivable. A young server named Jenny, barely 19 and working her first restaurant job, made a mistake. She brought the wrong wine to a table and didn't realize it until the customer mentioned it. It was a minor error. Easily fixed. But Greta, already on edge about the upcoming legal battle, exploded. She screamed at Jenny in the middle of the dining room during lunch service. Called her incompetent, stupid, worthless. She fired her on the spot, telling her to leave immediately. Jenny burst into tears and ran out. The entire restaurant went silent. Customers stared in shock. Several got up and walked out without paying. I was taking an order at another table. I excused myself, walked over to Greta, and spoke quietly but firmly. That was unacceptable. You just assaulted a teenager in front of witnesses. Greta whirled on me. Mind your own business. This is my business. Literally. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, something extraordinary happened. Every server in the dining room untied their aprons. Every single one. They set them on tables and walked toward the door. The bartender shut off the music. The busser stopped clearing plates. And they all left. Together. Silently. Within 2 minutes, Greta and Trevor were standing alone in a restaurant full of confused customers with no staff to help them. I was the last to leave. I hung my apron on the coat rack by the door and looked back at them. See you in court tomorrow. The hearing took place in a conference room at the county courthouse. My lawyer Veronica sat beside me, 3 folders of evidence stacked neatly on the table. Across from us, Greta and Trevor sat with their attorney, a tired-looking man who'd clearly been hired at the last minute. The mediator, a retired judge named Foster, reviewed the documents we'd submitted. Veronica presented our case methodically. She showed the revenue decline, the increase in complaints, the health code violations, the employee turnover rate, the unauthorized changes to business operations without stakeholder consultation. She played recordings, showed photographs, presented testimony from former employees. Trevor's lawyer tried to argue that I was a disgruntled employee causing problems. But Veronica shut that down immediately by presenting my ownership documents. Mr. Brennan isn't an employee. He's a legal owner. And as an owner, he has both the right and the responsibility to address mismanagement. The hearing lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Judge Foster set down his pen and looked directly at Greta and Trevor. I've reviewed all the evidence. Mr. Brennan's claims of mismanagement are substantiated. You've violated multiple provisions of your operating agreement. I'm ruling in his favor. Greta's face went white. Trevor gripped the table edge. You have 2 options, the judge continued. Sell your stake to Mr. Brennan at fair market value, or accept him as operational manager with full authority to make business decisions. Trevor chose to fight it. He hired a new lawyer and filed an appeal. But I knew they didn't have the money for a prolonged legal battle. Their restaurant was failing. Their credit was maxed out. They were drowning. So I waited. I didn't return to the restaurant. I didn't need to. The staff walkout had made it impossible to operate normally anyway. For 2 weeks, the Copper Kettle operated with skeleton staff. Greta and Trevor worked the dining room themselves, struggling through each service. Reviews online became brutal. Owners were rude. Food took an hour. Half the menu wasn't available. Then the liquor license renewal came up. Turns out Trevor had forgotten to file the paperwork on time. The license expired, which meant they couldn't serve alcohol until it was renewed. In a restaurant where alcohol sales represented 40% of revenue, that was catastrophic. The final blow came when their largest supplier, who'd been patient about late payments, finally demanded immediate payment of the outstanding balance, $42,000. They didn't have it. 3 days later, Trevor called my phone. We need to talk. I agreed to meet them at the restaurant after closing time. I arrived at the Copper Kettle at 10 p.m. The parking lot was empty except for Trevor's expensive SUV. Inside, the dining room looked sad. Half the tables were empty even though it was a Friday. The lighting seemed harsher than I remembered. The warmth was gone. Greta and Trevor sat at a corner booth, looking exhausted and defeated. I slid into the seat across from them and waited. Trevor spoke first, his voice quiet. What do you want? I pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. I want to buy you out. Fair market value, calculated by an independent appraiser. You walk away with your investment back, minus damages for operational losses. The restaurant returns to its original vision. Greta looked at the papers like they were poisonous. This is insulting. We invested everything into this place. You invested money. I invested 7 years of my life. There's a difference. Trevor scanned the documents, his jaw tight. If we refuse? Then we continue the legal battle. You spend money you don't have on lawyers. Eventually you lose and get nothing. Or the restaurant goes bankrupt and we all lose. I leaned back, my voice calm but firm. This is your best option. Take it. They tried to negotiate. Argued about valuations. Demanded more money. But Veronica had done her homework. The appraisal was fair. The offer was reasonable. They didn't have leverage. After 2 hours of discussion, Trevor finally cracked. We want all debts forgiven. We walk away clean. I considered this. I'll assume current operating debts. But your personal loans for the rebrand are yours. I'm not paying for your mistakes. He looked at Greta. She closed her eyes and nodded. Fine. I pulled out the sale agreement. Veronica had already prepared it, anticipating this outcome. They signed slowly, reluctantly, like each stroke of the pen was physical pain. When it was done, I gathered the papers and stood. You have until Monday to clear out your personal belongings. After that, the restaurant is fully under my control. Trevor looked up at me, his eyes full of resentment. You planned this from the beginning. You sabotaged us. I met his gaze steadily. I gave you every chance to succeed. You failed because you didn't understand what this place was about. You saw a business. I saw a community. That's why you lost. I left them sitting there in the restaurant that was no longer theirs. The news spread quickly through the local restaurant community. Within days, everyone knew the Copper Kettle was under new management. That the original silent partner had taken control. That things were changing back. I spent the weekend calling people. Former staff members. Original suppliers. Regular customers. Patricia, the sous chef who'd walked out, agreed to come back as head chef with a raise and full authority over the kitchen. 3 of the original servers returned immediately. Our local produce supplier agreed to resume deliveries at the original terms. The bread bakery owner, who'd been friends with Harold, actually cried on the phone when I told him we'd be ordering from him again. By Monday morning, when I officially took control, we were already halfway back to what we'd been. I spent the first week undoing all of Greta and Trevor's changes. We repainted the walls. Replaced the harsh lighting with warm copper fixtures. Printed new menus with the old recipes and the old prices. We changed the name back to the Copper Kettle. And we invited our regular customers to a welcome home dinner, free of charge. Mrs. Patterson was the first to RSVP. The Hernandez family made a reservation for their whole extended family. The dining room filled with familiar faces, people who'd been hurt by the changes and were thrilled to see the restaurant restored. The first week of operations under my full control was challenging. We were rebuilding systems, retraining staff, reconnecting with customers. But it felt right. Every decision made sense. Every change improved something. The staff noticed immediately. Patricia commented on how much more relaxed the kitchen felt. The servers said customers were happier. Even the dishwashers seemed more engaged. We weren't just running a restaurant. We were rebuilding a community institution. Revenue started recovering. Not overnight, but steadily. Regular customers returned and brought friends. Online reviews improved. Food bloggers who'd written negative reviews about the rebrand posted follow-ups praising the return to form. One evening, about 3 weeks after taking control, Harold stopped by. The original owner looked friendlier than I remembered, but his smile was genuine. He walked slowly through the dining room, touching tables, looking at the restored copper lighting. He sat at the bar and I poured him a glass of wine. You did it, he said quietly. You saved it. We did it together. You built something worth saving. He raised his glass. To the Copper Kettle. May it outlast all of us. We drank in comfortable silence, watching the busy dining room, listening to the sounds of conversation and laughter that filled the space. This was what success sounded like. 3 months after taking full control, the Copper Kettle was thriving again. Revenue had recovered to 90% of pre-Greta levels. Staff turnover had dropped to almost nothing. We'd received recognition from the local business association for community impact. I'd promoted Patricia to executive chef and given her profit sharing. She developed 3 new seasonal menu items that were instant hits. The servers were making better tips than ever because customers were happy and generous. Even our social media presence had recovered. Customers posted photos constantly, tagging us, recommending us, sharing their experiences. I still worked shifts occasionally. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to stay connected to the floor, to hear what customers were saying, to notice small problems before they became big ones. One Saturday night, I was clearing a table when I recognized someone sitting in a corner booth. Trevor. He was alone, a baseball cap pulled low, staring at a menu. I walked over calmly. Can I help you? He looked up, startled. For a moment we just stared at each other. I wanted to see it, he said finally. To see what you've done. I waited. It looks good. It looks right. I nodded slowly. Would you like to order? He shook his head and stood, pulling out his wallet. Trevor dropped 2 20s on the table, far more than the coffee cost. I was wrong, he said quietly. About everything. We thought we could make it better, make it ours. But we didn't understand what it actually was. I picked up the money and handed it back to him. The coffee's on the house. He looked at the bills in his hand, then at me. Why? Because this restaurant has always been about community. About treating people with dignity. I'm not going to change that because of what happened between us. His eyes got wet. He nodded and walked out quickly. I never saw him again. Greta, I heard through the restaurant grapevine, had moved to another city. She'd found work in corporate hospitality, where her aggressive management style apparently fit better. They'd both landed on their feet eventually. Just not here. As for me, I'd learned valuable lessons. About patience. About timing. About knowing when to be silent and when to speak. About how real power isn't loud or aggressive. It's quiet, strategic, and built on genuine relationships. The restaurant world is small. People talk. Reputations matter. Greta and Trevor would be remembered as the people who nearly destroyed the Copper Kettle. I'd be remembered as the person who saved it. A year after taking control, we celebrated the restaurant's 8th anniversary with a huge party. We invited everyone who'd been part of the journey. Current staff, former employees who'd moved on, suppliers, regular customers, even local competitors who'd helped during the transition. Harold gave a short speech about community and resilience. Patricia presented new dishes she'd been developing. I thanked everyone for their patience and support. But the best moment came when Jenny, the young server Greta had screamed at, stood up to speak. A year ago, I thought my restaurant career was over before it started. I thought one mistake had ruined everything. But Marcus taught me that good people build you up instead of tearing you down. Because of him, I'm enrolled in culinary school. I'm going to be a chef. The room erupted in applause. She came over afterward, giving me a tight hug. Thank you for showing me what good leadership looks like. I hugged her back, feeling genuinely emotional. This was why the fight had mattered. Not for revenge or victory, but for moments like this. For people like Jenny who deserve better. The party lasted until midnight. When everyone finally left, I stood alone in the quiet dining room, looking at the copper fixtures glowing warmly overhead. This place had cost me years of patience and strategy. But it had been worth every moment. The restaurant industry is brutal. Most establishments fail within their first 5 years. But the Copper Kettle thrived because it was built on something more than just good food and smart business. It was built on relationships. On treating people with respect. On understanding that success isn't just about profit margins and efficiency metrics. I'd learned that the hard way watching Greta and Trevor destroy what Harold and I had built. But I'd also learned that destruction isn't permanent if you're willing to fight for what matters. 2 years after taking full control, I opened a second location. Nothing fancy, just a smaller version of the Copper Kettle in a neighboring community. I promoted 2 servers to management positions and gave them partial ownership stakes. I wanted them invested, committed, part of the success. The second location opened to a packed house and positive reviews. It felt like validation of everything we'd built. People asked if I'd franchise, expand nationally, build an empire. I always said no. This wasn't about empire building. It was about creating spaces where people felt valued. Where staff were treated well. Where customers became family. You can't franchise that. You can't mass-produce community. You have to build it slowly, carefully, with intention and respect. That was something Greta and Trevor never understood. 5 years after the takeover, I sat in my office reviewing financial statements. Both locations were profitable. Staff retention was excellent. Customer satisfaction scores were the highest in the region. We'd won multiple awards. Best neighborhood restaurant. Best chef. Best workplace culture. But the thing I was most proud of wasn't listed on any financial statement or award certificate. It was the fact that 17 people had started their careers at the Copper Kettle and moved on to successful positions elsewhere. We'd become known as a training ground for hospitality professionals. Patricia had been recruited by a prestigious downtown restaurant but chose to stay with us. Why would I leave somewhere that treats me right? She'd said. 3 of our servers had gone to culinary school and opened their own places. They all stayed in touch, asking advice, sending customers our way. We'd built something that extended beyond our walls. A network of people who believed in doing things right. Harold passed away peacefully at 82. In his will, he left me a letter. Marcus, you understood what I was trying to build. You saved it when I couldn't. Thank you for keeping the copper polished and the kettle warm. You were always more than an employee. You were family. I framed that letter and hung it in my office. I never had to gloat about beating Greta and Trevor. Their failure spoke for itself. But sometimes, late at night when the restaurant was closed and I was alone doing paperwork, I thought about that moment when the wine glass shattered. When Greta screamed at me in front of customers. When they treated me like I was nothing. They'd assumed power came from being loud, from intimidation, from control. But real power is quieter than that. It's built on relationships, knowledge, patience, and strategy. I'd won not because I was louder or meaner. I won because I understood what actually mattered. The copper kettle wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for every person who'd been underestimated, dismissed, or mistreated by people who thought they were untouchable. Every time a customer thanked us for a great meal, every time a staff member told me they felt valued, every time a former employee came back to visit, those were my victories. On my 10th anniversary of ownership, I stood outside the restaurant at dusk, looking at the warm light spilling from the windows, listening to the sounds of conversation and laughter inside. This was home. This was family. This was everything I'd fought for. And no one could ever take it away again. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply outlasting the people who tried to destroy you. Sometimes it's building something so good, so genuine, so deeply rooted in community that it becomes unstoppable. That was my revenge. And it tasted better than anything we'd ever served.